Excited to welcome Thomas Glass, Dr. Thomas Glass, to talk to us today. Dr. Glass is an associate professor of epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He has a PhD in medical sociology from Duke University and did postdoctoral training in epidemiology at Yale School of Medicine. He's published over 85 peer-reviewed articles and directs the Baltimore Neighborhood Research Consortium. He's also the co-PI of the Baltimore Memory Study and co-directs a training grant in the epidemiology and biostatistics of aging. And so he's going to talk to us today about social context as a risk regulator. So join me in welcoming Dr. Glass.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here in a nice sized crowd. I'm going to try to talk for about 45, 50 minutes and leave time for questions. Any burning issues you want to ask in the middle, please do. I'm just going to start with my sort of overall objective here, which is to convince you of the potential importance of the concept of a risk regulator or something like it, and why I think it could serve the public health mission. And I've been trying to explain this concept since this paper came out, which I'll tell you more about, and I've not succeeded so far. So I'm using this talk to try a new angle, and I'm going to try to put this in a somewhat larger perspective to explain this concept, where it comes from, and why I think it's needed. So I have 4 parts to my talk. Part 1, why 49, the big question, the big picture question, and why we aren't asking it. Part 2, backing ourselves into a causal corner, causal talk as impediment in public health. Part 3, risk regulators and the stream of causation metaphor in 3 dimensions. And Part 4, analytic approaches to the study of neighborhood factors, some empirical examples. And I really only have time for 1. I'm going to start with this. I'm going to try to lay the big picture context for why I think this kind of idea has potential merit. And I start with this slide. I like to start every talk I do with this slide because I think for some reason the importance of this fundamental fact has generally been lost. Many of us have seen this kind of number before, but to me this is the big question. This shows average life expectancy in 2007 for the 50 highest ranked countries, followed in the U.S. Census Bureau's international database, and we rank 49th. And the question is why? Why is it that our life expectancy is 4 to 5 times shorter than other countries? Virtually every developed country and many developing countries have populations that live longer than we do. And the question is not only why, but what is it that we need to do in order to answer the question as to why? What sorts of things do we need to think about and study and emphasize? And are we doing that? Now, one possible explanation is the standard sort of causal risk factors may be working against us. And here's a slide showing cigarette consumption. And it turns out that with regard to this and many of the other standard sort of health jeopardizing risk factors, the U.S. actually does quite well. So this is clearly not an explanation for why 49. One could argue we don't get enough health care, but of course that argument borders on the absurd, since we are the world's big spender. In fact, the United States spends more in total dollars on health care than the rest of the developed world combined. We are way out in front and headed for over 19% of GDP by the year 2017. This is not an isolated or temporary trend in spending. We just keep getting more medicine, more imaging, more surgeries, more diagnostic procedures, and yet we continue to be next to the last among top 50 countries in average life expectancy. And of course I could have shown you many different indicators other than just average life expectancy. Now if you look at, I love this slide, if you look at the relationship between average life expectancy and spending per capita on health care, you see, first of all, that we are way, way out relative to anyone else. And if you fit a regression line, it turns out there is bang for your buck. If you spend more per capita on health care, you do see a generalized improvement in health care. But our country ranks way out in front on expenditure, but our performance is down here in the range of countries that are spending $1,000 a person. We're getting the same output or the same performance from countries like Ecuador, South Korea, Slovenia, Herzegovina, that are spending vastly fewer dollars on health care. So it's clearly not absence of health care. If you look at an even bigger picture about where the big gains in life expectancy have come over the last 100 years, it's quite clear that the majority of the increases in life expenditure occurred in the early part of the 20th century as a result of fundamental improvements in public health. And where sort of medicine and clinical care start to become more efficacious, not so clear what the role there is. So it seems to me one of the things we ought to be focusing on more are issues related to basic fundamental public health. Now that, unfortunately, is not what we do, particularly as reflected in the NIH's own budget priorities. Here we see 4 fiscal years. And if you look at the areas that are way out in front, we are convinced that more biotechnology, clinical research, genetics, neuroscience, and brain disorder, or what I would call high-tech medicine, is clearly the thing we need to do. And that's where our priorities have been. And if you look for basic public health, it's either kind of at the bottom or interspersed in other places. And one thing you don't see is the National Institute of why we're 49th and what is it about America that is killing people. That institute doesn't exist. The nature of the... In fact, it's very difficult even to find pockets of really, truly comparative research. People aren't asking what is going on in Japan and Andorra and other countries where people live longer. What is it about those places that are associated with increased life expectancy? And this, I think, is a kind of misplaced set of priorities. And the question is why, even though our keys are somewhere else. Let me turn briefly to obesity. I love obesity. I've done a lot of work on obesity. Obesity is a great problem to study from the standpoint of social factors, because here's a slide by an anthropologist that shows that every single rate of obesity exists somewhere. From great old Nauru at nearly 80%, all the way down to countries that are near zero. Every possible rate of obesity exists somewhere. And that ought to be enough to tell us that obesity is about environments. It's about places. It's about the characteristics of the places where people live. Now, we see the same pattern in the United States where over 20 years after fairly steady, fairly stable rates of obesity, something happened in 1980 that caused the doubling of obesity rates. The rates doubled in many other countries too, but because they started at a much lower level, their obesity rates in general among most OECD countries are less than half of what ours are. But we don't really have much research going on about why the Japanese are different than us. Very little work comparatively has gone on to try to answer questions about what happens when across different countries. And so while we all wring our hands and say, well, we don't know how to treat obesity other than bariatric surgery, actually the best treatment for obesity for Americans would be to send Americans who are fat to any other country. Now that ought to be a clue. That ought to be a clue. That ought to be a research agenda. And that says, in the proposed plan for obesity research 2011, priorities include animal models, complex signaling pathways in the brain and between other organs, obesity-related gene variants. We've been looking for them. We got 265 obesity-related gene variants. Half of them show up in some studies and then they disappear in others. But we've still not found the obesity gene. The belief that we will is it seems to be a myth that will not die. And of course now the new thing, epigenetics. Now, is there anything on this list that has general applicability to the question of how to solve the puzzle of this picture or this one? Is it possible that these magnificently dramatic patterns of obesity prevalence could be explained because we have different gene variants? That seems highly unlikely to me. And of course, no one is interested in exactly what the heck is going on in Japan or the Netherlands or Spain or France or any other country where obesity rates are much lower than we are. Now, I want to end this part of the talk by reminding you of some years ago, which I call the Rose Insight, which is to say, well, really in order to understand problems of population rates of disease, we need to ask different questions than understanding individual level risk for disease. This is one of his central theses. And so here's an example of that. We have homicide rates on the vertical axis in Chicago, Canada, and England and Wales. Now, if you only looked at individual level characteristics of perpetrators, and here I'm just looking at age of perpetrator, you would see that in the three places, the distribution of age of perpetrators is identical. It's identical. Individual level, what predicts what an individual, whether an individual will become a perpetrator or not, is consistent and similar across all three places. However, knowing age of perpetrator tells you absolutely nothing about the 300-pound elephant here, which is that look at the magnitude of difference in the rates from 0 to 900 per 100,000 population versus in Canada 0 to 60, 0 to 30. Extraordinary differences in the underlying rates at a population level. In order to understand rates at a population level, we need to appeal to characteristics of places to understand place-level differences in rates. And yet somehow that has become increasingly difficult to do within the NIH environment. And I'm trying to understand why it is that we continue to have a myopic focus on individual level variables that may tell us a lot about individual risk, but tell us nothing about why obesity rates, for example, or homicide rates are wildly different in different places. And here's a potential explanation, or partial one. And for this, I have to do a very quick and dirty review of philosophy. And if there are any philosophers here, I'm going to apologize because this is going to be extraordinarily simplistic and brief. But I want to remind you that within the great canon of philosophical discussion on the subject of cause, there are at least two main branches of the tree. One comes from David Hume, who spent a lot of time thinking about causation, and argued that in order to determine causation, he said we have to have demonstrated what he called a necessary connection. And if you read what he says about this, it becomes quite clear that in Hume's point of view, he's not sure that causal relationships actually even exist in nature. But if they do, it's unlikely we're ever going to know them, for reasons having to do with the limits of our own capacity to understand, imagine, and do science. So for Hume, the idea of talking about causes is an unnecessary adventure in metaphysical mysticism. Even pretending that we can identify causes is not only a bad idea, but a potentially dangerous and misleading one. Now, if you think that the idea of Hume is dead, consider Carl Pearson, who we all have heard of because of the Pearson correlation coefficient. What many of us don't know is that Pearson was famous for saying, once you know the correlation between two things, you know everything you need to know and everything there is to know. He was of the Humean perspective, which called into question the very notion that we could separate association from causation. He would have regarded that as an unnecessary adventure in metaphysical mysticism. Then along comes John Stuart Mill, father, if you might say, of logical positivism, who had a nervous breakdown at age 20. That's neither here nor there. Mill argued instead that, oh no, the world is governed by a set of universal laws waiting to be discovered. The universe works in a way where causes exist and can be discerned if we follow the rules of science. This was the age of enlightenment, and John Stuart Mill led the way towards the ideas that have given rise to the Rubin model, the potential outcomes model, and most of our thinking about causation contemporaneously. However, I would finally remind you as a historical note that when modern epidemiology first emerged, or the first textbook by McMahon and Pugh, there's very little discussion of cause. In fact, even in the first Surgeon General's report of 1964, the word cause does not appear in the same language that we see in later versions of the Surgeon General's report. Some skepticism. This was rather Humean perspective that they took on the idea of cause at first. Now this has all changed in the last 30 years, and what we now have, as characterized by my good friend Miguel Hernan at Harvard, is a definition of causal effect. This is the paper that sort of laid out, well, one of the papers that sort of laid out what has come to be a consensus about what we mean when we say cause. And basically, I'll run through this very quickly. Miguel's perspective, or the perspective of the potential outcomes framework, is that a causal effect can be defined as a comparison of potential outcomes. Present if average outcome had everyone been exposed does not equal average outcome had no one been exposed. And so we have to do this sort of mental calculus, or this mental thought experiment, in order to imagine a causal effect where we imagine one possible world where no one is exposed, and from which we gather the probability of disease given unexposure. And we have to imagine another world which is identical to the first world, including the fact that it has the same exact people in it, only everyone has been exposed. And the true causal effect then becomes the difference in the disease rates in those two possible worlds. Now the problem obviously is we only get to see one world, and the other world remains counterfactual. It's just an imagined world. This is the kind of thing that would make Hume roll over in his grave. Aha, see what I mean? Metaphysical mysticism in action. So to approximate this counterfactual world, we need a control group, which in a random trial is fairly straightforward. And in an observational study, we approximate this counterfactual condition by controlling on covariates. Now this has primed our thinking about what it is that can and cannot be classified as a cause. And one of the things that this means is that there are a whole range of things that make Japan and Andorra different than the United States, that are now off the radar screen as potential causes. They do not qualify because they do not fit the model. They do not fit the language of our causal speak. And one of those characteristics are attributes of places. Why? Well, number one, experiments are impossible to, or unethical and even difficult to imagine. Two, because the effects associated with places are non-specific, so living in a really poor place causes every possible bad outcome, but not with any great degree of specificity, and we all remember the canon of specificity from the Hill criteria. Non-random assignment to context makes exchangeable comparison groups impossible. Risk factors are chained together. They're not separable. Clinical trials are beautiful because we can give it a drug or a placebo and have that be completely independent of whatever other risk factors may be existing in the environment. But to talk about places, a place is a bundle of chained together risk factors that are not separable. In addition, the standard risk factors that we might want to study, once we've controlled for confounders, it leads to over-adjustment because these things are on the causal pathway in between where you live and health outcomes. Extreme stratification leads to violation of positivity assumption, meaning that if you study really bad neighborhoods, there may be no wealthy people or no white people living there, in which case adjusting for race causes a gross violation in positivity assumptions. The relationships between places and health may be complex and nonlinear, exogenous, or what's been called dependent happenings. Now, this has led my good friend Mike Oakes to say in a paper called The Misestimation of Neighborhood Effects, he says, we show that identifying useful independent neighborhood effect parameters as currently conceptualized is impossible. Therefore, neighborhoods, countries, other place-level characteristics are out the window as causes. And I'm essentially arguing that this idea of having a causal framework, a causal theory, that does not permit a whole range of variables that may be of incredible importance at explaining differences in disease rates, has sort of boxed us into a corner and made it very difficult to study, evaluate, and intervene on factors that aren't somehow, don't qualify as causes. Okay, so how have we tried to deal with this? Obviously, social epidemiologists have got to fight against this because these are the kind of things that these are our stock in trade. So there have been at least 3 approaches to dealing with this issue. One is Lincoln Phelan's fundamental causes framework that says, no, not only are these causes, but they're fundamental. And I'm going to say they're fundamental until I'm blue in the face. I'm not sure anyone's been listening. Secondly, the Eco-Social Epidemiology School by Krieger and Susser, and that has gained some traction, but has not yet, I think, convinced the field. The third approach has been popularized by Jay Kaufman and people like that, saying, let's study only social phenomena that can be subject to treatment assignment. And other than that, we're going to have to forget about the rest. Now, this has led to what's been called the Epi Wars, arguments about whether social factors belong in epidemiology. And some of the titles have been Social Epidemiology, No Way. To which Kaufman says, way, which gives you a sense of just about how, what the level of maturity has been in this debate, and sometimes it is that way. The failure of academic epidemiology, witness for the prosecution, and then our conscientious objection to the Epi Wars. So I don't think that this debate has been resolved in any satisfactory way. And we still don't have a clear idea of what to call variables that may matter but may not qualify as causes. And that is the context in which I tried to, or my colleague and I tried to introduce some new language and some new thinking into this problem in this paper, where we attempted to modify and extend the stream of causation metaphor, propose the risk regulator concept, address some of these causal inference problems, and used obesity as an example. Now, to just sort of quickly summarize what I mean by this, our thought was, we basically have an individual actor at the sort of behavioral level whose health behaviors we want to explain. Eating, sex, taking drugs, working, exercising, all of the real smoking, all of the real serious public health issues boil down to this sort of behavioral nexus, what it is people do in particular contexts. And below that, we have a series of sort of biological substrate that is basically organized around a series of centralized regulatory systems. And way up here above, we have these sort of macro level phenomenon like land use, culture, economics, and markets, which are very remote. Most people don't really know about them. People don't understand labor markets, but they influence them in some way. And so our argument was to say, let's focus on and develop some new language to understand what is in the middle. How is it that the effect of economics and labor markets gets down to the behavioral nexus and into the body, and ultimately affects these regulatory systems. What is the machinery that is associated with that transmission of forces? And the idea of the risk regulator was an attempt to get at that. These are meso or middle level factors that are visible and present in the lives of people. They are things that are within the conscious purview of individual actors, and which are essentially the conduits or channels through which upper level macro system factors get down to the behavioral level and influence behavior by creating opportunities and constraints for particular kinds of behaviors. And furthermore, also have direct linkages through both material exposures and non-material exposures into this biological substrate, potentially turning genes on and off, upregulating and downregulating metabolic processes and cardiovascular systems, etc. And this is sort of the big picture view of what we were trying to get at here. At a simpler level, the idea of a risk regulator was to say, you want to argue about what's a cause? Okay, fine. These are not causes. But what they are, we're going to try to use a kind of engineering language to talk about risk regulators as valves or levers that operate as system control parameters, operating above the heads of individuals and modifying the probability of certain behavioral states within given contexts in a way that would help us understand aggregate level population patterns of behavior and health outcomes. Now, some implications of this idea are, number one, it's a call to shift from the idea of health behaviors to health actions, where we bring agency back in and consider human beings as conscious strategizers rather than simply behavioral billiard balls responding in a stimulus response kind of way. It requires a shift from a focus on individual characteristics and personality traits to states that arise in particular circumstances and contexts. A shift from static self-report data to the need for real-time objective data across different action platforms. And a shift from highly deterministic models conceived of in a sort of very Mills-like Newtonian billiard balls kind of vision of the world to a dynamic systems modeling approach, and from a shift to single independent risk factors to risk regimes. And I'll say one thing about what I mean by that now. So what we normally do when we study a problem related to some health behavior like gun violence, some risk factor like a gunshot wound and disease, is we focus narrowly on a series of factors that are fairly downstream, or to use this topographical three-dimensional image, downhill from the factors that might differentiate different places. And when we focus only on those things, we tend to have a view of the importance of these factors that is exaggerated from the standpoint of more population-based thinking. What we really need to do is consider a more comprehensive and global perspective to talk about a concept like risk regime, which sees health behaviors, individual risk factors, and attributes within the larger context of place-level characteristics that may be uphill and which, through the force of gravity, may have strong influences on the distribution of these behaviors and risk factors. So we must go beyond the question of starting out with the idea of some people use guns and some people don't, and ask the question, what might be going on further uphill that determines how it is that guns are awash in some places and scarce in others. Places where violence is normalized in some contexts and very counter-normative in others. And if we do that, or in the absence of doing that, we get this sort of exaggerated sense of the role of these things. But if we were to examine a more comprehensive view of these factors, we would sort of develop this idea, what I call etiologic inertia, whereas we're not only just focusing on the sort of tip of the arrow here, which are the things, the bullet itself is ultimately the thing we'd all agree is the cause of death in handgun violence. But knowing what the cause is tells us very little about how the rates of gun death may vary across places. In order to do that, we need to travel further up this sort of arrow of etiologic inertia and understand factors uphill that give rise to different distributions of the behaviors and different probability that an individual will be shot. And this is terribly important in the context of what it is we're going to intervene on. For example, if we said, oh, well, the cause, and we can show this using counterfactual logic and in a clinical trial if we dared to do one, the cause of death in a handgun is the penetration of the human body and subsequent by a metallic projectile subsequent to exsanguination. Everybody can agree with that is the cause, but knowing the cause doesn't tell us anything about what is the best approach to intervention. Because if we focused on this as the cause, what would we do? We'd put Kevlar vests on everyone. And that's hardly the appropriate thing to do. Now, just because we have trouble shoehorning this into our idea of cause doesn't mean that trying to change something up here so that it cascades and produces a lower probability of things going on down here doesn't mean that we ought to focus on our interventions down here just because we can say unambiguously that that's the cause. And that's the sort of inner logic of the argument I'm trying to make. So now part 4, analytic approaches. There are, in fact, existing analytic approaches that I think can be utilized to study neighborhood characteristics in the context of this idea of a risk regulator. And I'll show you 3 examples. One is we can talk about a risk regulator as something that is a promoter or preventer of some important causal risk factor. Here's for example, environmental stress and high blood pressure might be an example. A second example would be a risk regulator as a magnifier or attenuator of some other risk factor disease association. And a third possibility is a risk regulator that is a secondary promoter or preventer involved in a larger chain of risk factor relationships. And very briefly, an example of the first kind that we've done is to show that neighborhood psychosocial hazards, which is a measure of how dangerous and scary and stress-evoking a neighborhood might be, we found to be associated with an increased risk of obesity in older adults, adjusting for a bunch of standard individual behavioral risk factors. And this comports nicely with animal models showing that stressed animals tend to consume more calories. The second example, that of a risk magnifier, we did a study showing that the same variable neighborhood psychosocial, living in a dangerous and scary neighborhood, actually upregulates or magnifies the effect of bone lead on cognition. So that if you live in a high-stress neighborhood, the effect of lead on your brain is exacerbated. So, and these are fairly straightforward kinds of analyses. You recognize this as an effect modification hypothesis. This stuff is relatively straightforward. Now, I'm going to give you a third example here in the next 5 minutes that I think is a little bit more novel and interesting. And I'll set it up by saying that neighborhood risk regimes may influence injection use behavior. Injection drug users are highly mobile. Selection into neighborhoods may be associated with health. and that there is this problem of time-varying confounders affected by prior exposure, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. Regular old regression model adjustment leads to a collider stratification bias and the underestimate of the effect of the neighborhood variable. And one possible better strategy, which is good for this secondary risk promoter idea, is the use of inverse probability weighting and marginal structural models. So here's the kind of problem we have. We have people who are moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, injection drug users. And it may be that there are factors in their covariates that determine where they live. But more than that, there's also the possibility that some of these intermediate risk variables are themselves determined by what neighborhood you're in. And therefore they are on the causal pathway between exposure and the outcome. If we adjust for all these things as if they're confounders, then we make the effect go away and we're essentially overestimating. And this is the central problem that plagues most neighborhood research. As you look at a crude association between neighborhood and some outcome, and it's really strong. You adjust for a bunch of individual level covariates and the neighborhood effect goes away. And my argument is that it's primarily because we're adjusting for things that are actually on the causal pathway, and it's a case of time varying confounding affected by prior exposure, and that leads to bias toward the null. So we tested this using the alive cohort with age linked to intravenous experience. 3,000 injection drug users recruited in '88 and followed twice a year. We geocoded 41,000 visits, very high retention rate, and analyzed these visits to understand and model the drug cessation behavior as a function of a primary exposure of interest, which in this case was neighborhood poverty. Now we did this analysis first in a crude way, and there is in fact a strong crude association where less neighborhood poverty is associated with, in a dose-response way, a higher probability of injection drug use cessation. When we go to the standard regression adjustment, however, the effect is severely attenuated and essentially is no longer significantly different than zero. And therefore, adjust for all the intermediate covariates and the effect goes away. Using the inverse probability of weighting approach, which has the advantage of being able to adjust not only for baseline covariates, but takes account of this time-varying confounding problem, we recover a significant association where less poverty means a higher probability of injection drug cessation. So another example. Now, there are lots of other less well-known and less well-developed approaches that I think could be used to understand and study the idea of risk regulators. Community-level experiments, I just showed you marginal structural models, instrumental variables and natural experiments. But there are some additional approaches on the horizon, including sort of super multi-level models where you really have country-level differences and multiple sub-nested systems within that. Dynamic systems modeling, agent-based modeling, and biobehavioral signal processing where you're gathering real-time data on individuals as they move through different contexts. So these are some of the things that I think are in the future going to help us better to get our hands around this kind of idea. So the take-home message for my talk today: the U.S. is a super efficient disease-generating machine. And we are less focused on explaining and understanding why that is, and I think we ought to be. One of the reasons I think that it's been difficult to frame the question in a way that might lead to better, more progress in public health is that we have adopted and come to some rocky consensus about our definition of cause that makes it very difficult to justify studying factors that might not be causes, but might be ideal targets for intervention and might be the important features that allow us to intervene in ways that would make a difference at a population level. So instead of asking what are the causes of obesity, we ought to instead be thinking about what are the upstream risk regulators that we can change that might have a minuscule or small effect on individual risk, but would shift entire population distributions. And I see some of you recognize that this, once again, is the language of Jeffrey Rose. And this is an idea that's been around a long time. For some reason, it's never quite gotten traction. But the problem of obesity is not going to be solved through bariatric surgery or identifying an obesity gene. At least that's what I would argue. And finally, this idea of risk chaining, that risk regimes form an entire sort of suite or portfolio or linked together set of risk factors that adhere at the level of place. And the idea of sort of partialing them out and looking at them independently, I think, is a fundamental methodological and causal error. Lots of colleagues have helped me develop this work, including people who've worked on the Baltimore Memory Study. I am very thankful to a number of graduate students I've worked with, including Arijit Nandi, who I understand just left Harvard. He was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar there, and he was the first author on that paper that we did looking at injection drug use. So thank you very much, and I would love to entertain any questions you might have in the last 5 minutes or 7 minutes that we have. I saw your hand first. You're second. How about that? There's nobody in my field who's not very familiar with the 3 examples of behavioral science, social epidemiology that's appeared in the journal Science. We all know them. We're very proud of them. I'm very proud of that group for doing that. Yeah. So the question would be, I think their work fits very nicely into the schema that I have tried to put forward, in the sense that they are placing the emphasis on a characteristic of places rather than the characteristics of the individuals there. Now, I should say that the Chicago Project on Human Development is the superconducting super collider of social science studies. And they have the resources and the capacity to measure things like collective efficacy at a community level that far exceeds what most of us are able to do, which is terrific and quite a brave study to have pulled off. But the emphasis on collective efficacy as a variable that exists at a higher level of organization and may itself have very weak and small and negligible effect on the risk of any one person being subject to violence, but yet is a very potent and robust predictor of violence rates, shows a really important thing, which is that if you want to know where to intervene, why consider intervening at the level of individual risk factors for violence when the intervention target of identifying the characteristics that lead to collective efficacy makes a lot more sense from a bang for the buck point of view. So I think their study would be one of my top 5 all-time studies in line with the thinking I'm trying to propose. Yes?
plays out in so many different ways. How social inequality might fit into all those.
Right.
Well, it is place-based, but it's even more.
Okay, so the question is, how does inequality fit into this framework? Well, I have 3 comments about that. One is, the old psychology experiment, faces, vases, faces, vases. You can't see both. When people say inequality, there's this sort of gestalt shift that goes back and forth, where on the one hand, people can think of inequality as a characteristic of places, vis-a-vis the Gini index. Inequality could be a statement about the distribution of rewards and opportunities at place level, or inequality could mean individual level income. And often what happens in public health is that we somehow instinctively make the shift when somebody says inequality and everybody makes the faces to vase shift and then immediately starts talking about individual income. Or you want to study population level inequality, but you want to put in individual level income as a confounder. And poof, away goes the effect of inequality. So that's a cautionary note about the importance of inequality. Second of all, the study of inequality goes back hundreds of years and has been one of the most consistent and clear topics of conversation in public health going back to the very beginnings of the sanitation movement, for example. In my view, it is important to begin to unpack inequality and understand more precisely what exactly it is about conditions of inequality that lead to differences in behavior and health outcomes. The idea of embodiment is an attractive idea. However, I'm always a little bit suspicious about our desire to zoom in and focus on what's going on under the skin. And I agree that that's a problem. And I agree that epigenetics offers an opportunity to link what's going outside to what's going on inside, and it's very exciting. But if you take the whole pie of what we think about and worry about, and what fraction of it is focused on what's going on inside the skin, particularly inside the brain, under the skull, relative to what's going on outside of the skin that might give rise to these things, I think we are so far out of balance that I'm actually more in favor of out-of-bodiment. I am more interested in further articulating the conditions from the skin out and how the formation of social structure gives rise. One quick example of that, the concept of stress. Everybody throws around the idea of stress. Stress, stress, stress. Everybody studies stress. Where does stress come from? From where does stress emanate? We do this faces vase thing, and somehow stress somehow becomes like a personality quirk, or some sort of random thing that pops up in the context of our daily lives. But if stress is to have any meaning, stress has to be a physiologic reaction to some environmental phenomenon. Now, what is that environmental phenomenon? Is it a stressor? Well, the word stressor I have a lot of problems with. Happiness is a biological state. The things that make me happy, I don't call them happiers. The idea of a stressor hides from us something. It hides something. I prefer the language of psychosocial hazard. That is the thing in the environment that evokes, in all mammals, an adaptive challenge that is either a positive or a negative stress response. And I want more focus on what it is outside, what it is that's going on in neighborhoods that evokes stress. Where right now we tend to regard stress as exogenous. It pops out of nowhere, or it's a characteristic of individuals. There's very, very little work to try to understand where stress comes from where it emanates. I forget whose hand was next. Okay.
Given especially what you just said, on one of your last two slides, you had the notion of biobehavioral signaling.
Yeah.
You said you could measure, I think, biobehavioral factors when people are moving towards time and place. So if I could play devil's advocate, why should we care that you're also saying the focus should kind of be on the outside, just to understand the mechanism?
No, if I want to understand, the effect of place on blood pressure, and I get a cohort of people, and I do the same thing we've been doing for 30 years, which is I do a cohort study, and once a year I sit someone in a chair and I measure their blood pressure 3 times. And then I do it again the next year. And I look for the effect of places based on where they say they live on the blood pressure readings I get there, and then a year later, and a year later, I will have learned nothing. Because all I'm getting is some grand super mean average. What I'm missing is how someone's blood pressure changes when they're in the car in traffic, when they're standing in front of a group at NIH trying to convince them of something. If we take the idea of contextualism seriously, we've got to measure the dynamic characteristics of human functioning and behavior dynamically in real time so we can match people's behavioral and physiologic states to the context in which they are in now. This is what I mean by moving from traits to states. So right now what we do is we measure psychological things like coping or social networks or things like this statically once a year in time. And then we learn nothing because it is only in the dynamicity of these phenomena, changing context to context, that the patterns that I think are really there emerge. And we're simply stuck on paper and pencil things to measure things like social support and social networks and efficacy and all these other things, even though we know that they are themselves subject to horrendous measurement error. We can't find a new way to do it, and I think a new way is emerging, and it's largely emerging because of these. And if you just think for a minute about what this could do to measurement in behavioral and social science, because it's location, it's communication, it's social interaction in real time, and you can put it on a map and identify how and study how being in one kind of place affects behavior versus being in another kind of place. You don't look convinced.
No, I actually agree with you.
Okay.
But I'm trying to put it in the context of you're focusing more on outside the box stuff.
Yeah, so when we take somebody into a clinic and we take them and we ask them a survey, we're essentially decontextualizing them. We're saying on average, all other things being equal. And by the way, let me remove you from any context for the purposes of filling out this survey. Because I want to wash all that away. I mean, that's the great legacy of Lazarsfeld and the survey revolution was that it gave us a tool we never had before. But that tool has now outlived its usefulness. And while there are some advantages to getting responses to survey and questionnaires that are completely decontextualized, at the same time, it completely impoverishes our ability to understand the role of context. Because it's only by real-time data collection of people in context while they're living in context, which was not even imaginable to Lazarsfeld, that that we can really elucidate how being in one kind of neighborhood or place affects you physiologically or behaviorally compared to another. I mean, the behavioral economists have started to figure this out. Like they discovered, somehow economists have discovered that human beings are social and not always rational in all those things. Oh, wow, congratulations. Nobel Prize for that. But it turns out economists find out that you take a teenager and you put them in a lab and ask them questions about their health behaviors, their smoking, et cetera, and they'll give you one set of answers that will be right. You take them in a bar, fill them with drinks, in a dance club where the music is pounding, and they've done this experiment, and you put them in what's called a hot state, and their answers are completely different. Their physiology is different. Their behaviors are different in ways that they would never have been able to predict, explain, even to themselves, had you asked them in a cold state. So this idea of contextually determined physiology and behavior is only studyable if we're actually putting sensors on people and observing them as they move through context. That's the argument I would make. Did you have a question?
It's almost a comment. Board meeting was that yesterday. There's a microcosm and a real parallel between public health and drug health. What's going on in education in this country? I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but there was this huge emphasis in the last 10 years on randomized control trials in education, because the logical positive is all we have to do is do that, be more like medicine, and find out what works when we do it. And of course, what's happened is null effects all over the place. What works clearinghouse, the Department of Ed has, tells you what it doesn't work, but null effects. But it's the same kind of thing. You know, they're missing the forest. But and again, I don't know how much we spend per capita on education, but I'm betting there's close parallels, at least to some of the things that you've done in the public health. And I'm going to actually send your paper in your name to John Easton, who's the head of because I really do think they're just missing the forest for the trees in the same way that we sometimes do in terms of not studying things with at least a little bit more of this stuff. At least believing that all we have to do is randomize it and causally.
Right. Well, of course, every school is nothing but a tree that's standing in some forest. And if we ignore the forest, and we see that some schools do poorly and not others, we may misattribute the influence. Now, because we can sort of randomize schools, we can imagine randomizing schools, that becomes the thing we're going to look at to identify the causal effect of schools. But in the meantime, we're going to ignore the fact that schools are lodged within communities. And the pathologies that walk through the door of every school are the pathologies that have their origins in communities, some of which are very pathological. So intervening at the level of schools is like focusing on the tip of the arrow and forgetting the causal forces that emanate further uphill. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. Now, the question is, can I think of a way to falsify? I apologize for what I'm about to say, but I do not worship at the altar of Karl Popper. And I actually think that this is part of what I mean. The doctrine of falsification is I think, part of the reason we study the wrong things and make little progress. People are always, I'm at Hopkins in epidemiology, people are always reminding me that the clinical trial, which is, standard Popperian falsifiable science, is the king of evidence. And I always ask people, which do you believe more about whether the polio vaccine worked? The fact that the clinical trials done on the polio vaccine worked, or the fact that polio went away in the population? Which do you believe constitutes a higher standard of evidence? So if you take if you talk to engineers or meteorologists or people who think post-Popper and post-Newton about nature, if you talk to evolutionary scientists and you throw this sort of falsification idea in front of them, they say, you don't get it. Nature doesn't work that way. And the doctrine of falsification is as much of an impediment as anything. Now, that is not an easy pill, because if I'm sick and have a disease and want to know whether drug A works better than drug B, I want Karl Popper on my side. Absolutely. The question is, are all questions that are relevant to us in public health best suited to that model of science? to that model of science. And so far, we have been trying to squeeze every round peg into that particular square hole. And I envision a day in which there's a pluralism of epistemologies, of which kind of Popperian falsification and a hypothesis and the whole hypothesis testing machinery that follows it is just one of a multiple set of epistemological tools. Now we aren't there yet, but the barbarians are at the gates. You know, if you tried to talk about falsifiable discrete hypotheses and linear deterministic models to a meteorologist trying to predict the weather, you would find that they're in a different world, as are engineers. And I've been trying to learn a lot from engineers about the way they think about these things. Probably not a satisfactory answer, but best I got right now. Thanks. Thank you.